1. The Man from the Past. Like an army of ants fresh from an anthill, the audience came out of the cinema silently. The film had been so moving, rendering most of them speechless, for the heroine had discovered, too late, that the man she was about to marry was her stepfather. She had gone to Zimbabwe on a short holiday to visit the spectacular Victoria Falls, and while she was there had fallen in love with a train driver who, it turned out, was the man who had eloped with her mother years ago when the heroine was a mere toddler. "Where is my mother?" the heroine demanded after the moment of truth had arrived. The answer was that the mother was dead. She had died in hospital after losing her memory in a car accident a few days after she had run away with the man. The overdressed, heavily perfumed ladies clung to their escorts firmly as if afraid they would suddenly find out that the man they were with was their stepfather. Fortunately, most of the escorts knew how to handle women. They had been sugar daddying for years. They merely stroked the woman on the head rhythmically and squeezed their light fingers in a caressing manner. Among the very few ladies who had a husband for an escort was Julia. At 25, she was convinced that life for her had a meaning because the man she was with was the best husband around town. There was simply nobody like him, so tender, so loving. Dan was a short man and had an ordinary face. If you saw it only once, you wouldn't remember it again. But if you looked at him for slightly longer, you would certainly notice his ears. They were too big, and made him look like a frightened hyena. He was a doctor. Julia was tall and slightly on the plump side. She had big eyes which sparkled mischievously every time she smiled. She wasn't beautiful enough to warrant a Miss Africa title, but she was good-looking enough to make men envy her husband. Suddenly, Julia froze in her tracks. Her eyes had somehow met the doorman's. She stood transfixed for a moment, holding up the cue streaming out of the auditorium. "Are you all right, Julie?" Dan asked, peering at her anxiously the moment he felt her go rigid. Julia began, then started walking again, her heart hammering away uncontrollably. The doorman stared at her for a moment longer, then turned his attention to the other well-to-do city personalities. But his attention on the other people was short-lived, for he quickly swung round and started following Julia and her husband. Julia didn't look back, but her mind was in total chaos. "It can't be, it's impossible," she muttered to herself. "I must be crazy. That can't be Alphonse. It can't be. But then, those eyes are for sure his." "Are you all right, Julie?" asked Dan again as he felt her shudder. "I'm not feeling too good," she said somewhat absent-mindedly, for her mind was still on the doorman. What was Alphonse doing in a doorman's uniform? What was he doing in Malawi, for that matter? "What's your game, Alphonse? You belong to the past and you ought to stay there," wailed Julie's heart. "Why did you come back, Alphonse?" Reaching their Datsun coupe, Dan unlocked the door for her before sliding into the driver's seat. He started the engine and pressed the play button on the cassette player. "Dan, switch it off," muttered Julia, her mind refusing to consider anything except the doorman's eyes. "Please." "Sorry, Julie." Dan backed the Datsun out of the parking space and was about to join the road leading away from the cinema premises when he heard the tap on his window. He stepped on the brakes and wound down the window to look at the man who had stopped him. "Lost a wallet, sir?" the man asked. "Me? I don't use wallets," chuckled Dan. "Must be someone else's. Or is it yours, madam?" Julia glared at the doorman without a word, but her eyes were flashing out one message: "Leave me alone." "Good night, my good people," the man said and walked away. Dan shrugged his shoulders and drove off, fast. The mood Julia was in disturbed him. She had never been in such a withdrawn mood before. She was like a capsule now, not to be punctured. "Julie, can I take you to the hospital?" Dan asked, slowing down. No. "I'm fine," came the reply from her. He didn't pursue the matter. He stepped on the accelerator again, sending the car shooting forward. When they reached home, Julie refused to touch the supper, claiming she had lost her appetite. "A bit of juice will do you some good, Julia," said Dan, trying to force himself to eat. He was used to eating with her despite the fact that as a doctor he could be called out at any time. No, thanks, Dan. Let me check your temperature then. Really, Dan, I'm fine. It's just a headache I have. That night, Julia hardly slept. Scenes from the past wouldn't give her a moment's rest. There was no way she could forget the doorman. For she was sure the doorman was Alphonse. The voice hadn't changed much, the face had, the eyes hadn't. It was the same Alphonse he had known years ago in Zimbabwe. She had been young then. About 13, and about to sit for her standard 6 exams in Mufakos. But she had been too big for her age. Everybody said so. One day her mother had given her money to pay the electricity people in town. She had done this errand before, so it was not a problem. She got on a bus and to her pleasant surprise Alphonse was on the same bus, dressed in a tracksuit. "Hi, Ju," he said as she sat down next to him. "Hi. How far, eh? Town. Paying the electricity bill. Eh?" His eyes widened as he sat up. After a moment he edged closer to her and asked, "How much?" $50. All that? He whistled. It must be overdue. I think so. Eh? He was thoughtful for a moment before continuing. I say, Ju, do you have to pay today? What do you mean? She asked, puzzled, her eyes on him. Come on, Ju, you know what I mean, he said with a laugh, patting her on the knee. I don't think so. Come on. But what do you mean? You can pay after 2-3 days, eh? Meaning? Julia frowned. Ju, you give me the money today and I'll give it back to you the day after tomorrow. And no. She shook her head, her eyes not leaving him. I'm serious, Ju. My old man is in hot soup. I'll repay you, eh? Cher and I have a project going, we'll get some dough, eh? Alphonse had never yet let her down, but his yearning for money was insatiable. On more than 3 occasions he had managed to get some money from her, though he had always turned up the next day and paid back what he owed her. The first time he had asked her for money was the day her father had given her $12 to buy herself school uniform. When Alphonse had seen the small wad of notes, his eyes had danced with unconcealed excitement. He had managed to talk her into lending it to him on the understanding that he would pay a day later. Although her father had wanted to see the uniform that day, she had succeeded in convincing him that she had left it at the tailor's for a few alterations. The following day, Alphonse kept his promise. Now as she looked at him, she realized that for the first time she wasn't going to give him the money. To start with, $50 was a lot of money. Where would he get it from in order to pay her back? Secondly, if she didn't pay, wouldn't the electricity people come rushing to the house to disconnect the wires? Not only that, her mother was not somebody to play games with. Once that woman saw red, you would be in trouble, for she was the type of person who would beat the daylights out of you on the veranda in the presence of all the neighborhood children. Everybody knew that Alphonse came from a poor family, but not everybody knew that he was interested in Julia. His father was a drunkard whose hands shook in the morning if he didn't take a drink. He had long since given up drinking tea or coffee. His breakfast was a bottle of beer and fried maize, heavily salted. So where would Alphonse get the money to pay her back? You know I can give you the money, Alphonse, she said firmly. Why not, I say? Haven't I always kept my word, eh? Of course she knew that, but $50 was a lot of money. And of course she knew he never was broke for long, a fact that sometimes puzzled her, bearing in mind that his father was a renowned drunkard. Maybe because he was a good footballer, he got lots of money for every game played. Maybe. But that day Julia firmly refused to part with the money, not because she didn't trust him, but because she was afraid that if she didn't settle the bill that day, maybe the electricity people would decide to come with their pliers and disconnect the supply. Then her mother would really be mad. A couple of stops later, Cher jumped on the bus. A pompous and showy character, he was dressed in hip football uniform. He nodded to Alphonse and Julia before securing himself a seat somewhere in front as if to keep an eye on the driver. Cher was a bully who, apart from being an excellent footballer, was a notorious petty thief. He had already been to a reformatory but had come out without any change in his moral or social behavior. Why Alphonse and Heath flocked together was anybody's guess. Perhaps the common denominator was that they were both footballers. They parted company in town. Julia went to the electricity people, while Shea and Alphonse set off for one of the hotels where they said they were going to meet a certain American tourist. When Julia returned home later in the day, she found her parents locked in a heated argument. Apparently, Alphonse's father had come crawling to them to beg for some money to settle a court case. In one of his drunken stupors, he had assaulted a couple of women who had not hesitated to seek the services of the law. The court's ruling was pay a fine of $100 or serve a prison sentence. Alphonse's father had tried all he could to raise the money without any success. His drinking mates said there was little they could do to help him, for they themselves were neck-deep in debt. Even his bosses turned him down, saying that he already owed them quite a substantial amount. In desperation, he turned to Julia's father, who was an understanding man, and, not only that, the two men were both immigrant workers from Malawi. Julia's father was willing to help, but his wife said he would be throwing his money down the drain, for Alphonse's father would never repay him. Never. We are not a charity office. Julia's mother thundered, breathing heavily. Listen, woman, that man is from home. We are not the only Niases around. She retorted. That man has a family too. Then he should stop drinking, she snapped. We've got to help him, he muttered inaudibly, under his breath, and you call yourself a church elder? No. You give him a cent, I repeat, you give him a cent, and I'm packing. I'll be going home. She stormed out to the kitchen. Julia stood still in the sitting room, not knowing whether to go to her bedroom or go to the kitchen. What she had heard was disturbing, for she could not imagine a family without a father surviving in Mufecos. If Alphonse's father was locked up in some jail, what would happen to his family? What would happen to Alphonse and the other children? She shuddered at the thought that Alphonse might be forced to go away. You couldn't say she was in love with him, but she admired him quite a lot. Maybe it was because he was a constant reminder to her of the photo in the family album. It was the photo of her father dressed in faded football uniform taken years ago when he was in his teens. She liked to imagine he used to be as good a player as Alphonse was. Maybe the other reason was that no boy had ever kissed her except him. And it was Alphonse who had made her lose her virginity. That evening, Alphonse's mother came knocking at the door. Are you there? She asked. Here. Julia's mother called back and stood up from the dining table. She dug her fingers into her husband's ribs. I'll say you are away. Go into the bedroom. But. SHH. She went to the door and unlocked it. Her husband disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Julia at the table. Sibangile, the elder sister, was away at a boarding school at that time. Come in, Mrs. Josephotti. Mrs. Josephotti walked into the room nervously. In her cheap, crumpled dress, she appeared out of place. Join us, we're having a meal, Julia's mother said, smiling like a perfect hostess. No thank you. I've filled my belly already. Sure. Just a bite. Next time, Mrs. Masamba, Mrs. Josephotti said grimly. At 35 she looked a great deal older than her age. She had a sad, resigned face which gave the impression that she had come to accept that life was full of misery. She was thin and had hollow cheeks which made her cheekbones stand out. How are the children? She asked in Chichewa. As usual, a cough there, malaria here, replied Julia's mother, not in Chichewa but in the language of Mufecos, Shona. Too bad. Mrs. Josephotti obviously didn't want to dilly-dally, for she immediately asked whether Mr. Masamba was home. If he wasn't, had he put aside the $100 her husband had asked for? He isn't home, Mrs. Masamba answered and went on, and about the money, I'm afraid it's impossible to. Mrs. Josephotti raised her eyebrows. Go on, she said, frowning deeply. We can't help. I'm sorry. Mrs. Masamba, the thin woman began desperately, do you know that my husband has nobody else to turn to? If you can't give a hand, then he's going to be sent to jail. I'm sorry. Please help, Mrs. Masamba. We are all foreigners in this country. If we can't help each other, do you think we'll get anywhere? The woman's voice was shaking. I'm sorry, but please help. We'll pay you back. I know my son Alphonse will pay you back after a week or so. He told me he would, please. I'm sorry. Mrs. Masamba repeated, her eyes avoiding Mrs. Josephati's. Please, we'll pay you back. I know, but we don't have that kind of money. Please. Mrs. Josephati was close to tears now. She started wringing her hands. I'm sorry. After a time, Mrs. Josephati knew she wasn't going to get any help there. She got to her feet slowly and extended a hand to Mrs. Masamba, who took it with a measure of suspicion. They shook hands briefly. Well, so long, Mrs. Masamba. I'm sorry we can't help. I know. At the door, Mrs. Josephati stopped to say, You're a cruel woman. May the Lord be with you. Mrs. Church Elder. Mrs. Masamba was taken aback because Mrs. Josephati was not the kind of woman who normally went about insulting people in their own homes. She was a cool-headed woman whose greatest mistake had been to marry an incorrigible drunkard. Julia's mother decided to pretend she hadn't heard anything. When she returned to the table, she noticed that her daughter wasn't eating anymore. She was about to ask why, but had second thoughts about it. She got up to call her husband to come back to the table, but he said, no thanks, he had lost his appetite. Julia rose from the table and went straight to bed without bothering to clear up the table. Her thoughts were on what Mrs. Josephati had said to her mother, You're a cruel woman. That's true, she thought, recalling the times her mother had scolded her for very minor faults. Sometimes, her mother would rummage through her briefcase to look for brief notes from her boyfriends. She was always suspicious of Julia, thinking she was up to no good. That woman. Maybe she knew about the relationship between Alphonse and her. Maybe she was being deliberately nasty to the Josephates so that if the man went to prison, Alphonse and the family would be forced to go away and she could say, good riddance. 2 days later, Alphonse's father was driven by the police to prison to serve his sentence. And a week after his arrest, Alphonse and Shea were caught red-handed after breaking into a shop owned by a local business magnate. The court ruled that they should not be treated